Before it was an icon, it was a theory. Before it was a theory, it was a problem nobody could solve. Just a cold, fast river separating two of the most important cities in America, with no crossing and no obvious way to build one. Nobody looked at the East River in winter because it was jammed with ice floes, ferries frozen in place, tens of thousands of commuters stranded, and thought, suspension bridge. But 14 years later, the United States had the longest suspension bridge ever built on Earth, crossing 1,595 feet of open water, held up by 4 cables made of 19,000 miles of wire. And the man who designed it was dead before the first stone was even laid.
This is the story of how Brooklyn Bridge was built, and I used AI to bring its construction process to life, so let's get into it.
Brooklyn and Manhattan were separate cities. That sounds strange now, but in the 1860s it was just fact. Brooklyn was already the 3rd largest city in America. Its residents worked in Manhattan, which meant crossing the East River every single day on a ferry. The ferry worked fine in summer. In winter, it did not. When the river froze, the boats stopped. In the winter of 1866-67, the East River iced over completely and stayed that way for weeks. Workers who needed to be in Manhattan for their shifts couldn't get there. The city's patience with the ferry situation had been wearing thin since the 1850s, and after that winter, it ran out entirely. A German-born engineer named John Augustus Roebling had been proposing a bridge across the East River since 1855. He had already built suspension bridges over the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh and across the Niagara Gorge. He had also developed his own wire rope manufacturing process, replacing the braided hemp that most bridges of the era still used. He understood what a long-span suspension bridge needed better than almost anyone else, but for over a decade he had been told, no, not yet, be patient. In 1867, the New York Bridge Company was incorporated by the state legislature. John Roebling was appointed chief engineer. His design was bigger than anything previously built. The main span would be 1,595 feet, nearly 50% longer than the longest suspension bridge in existence. The 2 granite towers would rise 272 feet above the river, taller than nearly every building in New York City. The 4 main cables would carry 6 times the load the bridge was ever expected to bear. Roebling deliberately over-engineered every calculation because he knew things would go wrong, and he wanted enough margin to survive them. The cables themselves would be steel wire, not iron. Most engineers still preferred iron. Roebling had tested steel extensively and didn't care what most engineers preferred. He had one other condition. His own company in Trenton, New Jersey would supply the wire. This detail would matter later, and not in a good way. But in the summer of 1869, the project hadn't started yet. Roebling was still on site conducting surveys, pinpointing the exact position of the Brooklyn Tower Foundation. On June 28th, he was standing at the Fulton Ferry slip when an incoming ferry boat came in too fast and crushed his foot against the dock's timber piling. His toes were amputated on the spot. What followed was worse. Roebling refused further conventional medical treatment. He was convinced that hydrotherapy, continuous washing of the wound with water, was superior to anything the doctors were offering. Tetanus set in within 3 weeks. On July 22, 1869, John Roebling died of lockjaw. He never saw a single stone of his bridge. His son, Washington Roebling, was 32 years old. He had worked under his father on the Niagara and Cincinnati bridges. He was appointed chief engineer in his father's place, handed a set of plans for the most ambitious construction project in American history, and told to get on with it. Washington Roebling's first problem was the river bottom. The 2 towers needed to rest on bedrock. On the Brooklyn side, bedrock sat roughly 43 feet below the riverbed, deep but reachable. On the Manhattan side, bedrock was somewhere between 79 and 98 feet down, buried under layers of silt, sand, loose gravel, and boulders deposited by glaciers thousands of years earlier. No American engineer had excavated to that depth in open water before. Roebling had to design the method from scratch. The solution was the pneumatic caisson. A caisson is an enormous sealed wooden box, open at the bottom, that is sunk to the riverbed and pressurized with compressed air to hold back the water. Workers descend into it through shafts, excavate the riverbed beneath it, and as the riverbed is cleared, the caisson sinks. The weight of the masonry tower being built on top presses it down. When it finally reaches bedrock, the entire chamber is filled with concrete and becomes the permanent foundation. The Brooklyn caisson was built and launched in 1870. It was 171 feet long, 102 feet wide, and constructed from layers of timber up to a meter thick, covered in iron plate and sealed with marine tar. Workers climbed down through airlocks and dug by candlelight and gas lamp under 2 atmospheres of compressed air. The hardest sections of riverbed were blasted with powder charges. Debris was loaded into containers and hauled up through water-filled shafts while the men worked below. In December 1870, a fire broke out inside the caisson, likely sparked by a gas jet flame igniting the timber overhead. It burned for 3 days. Engineers eventually flooded part of the chamber to put it out. When they pumped it dry and inspected the damage, the timber above the fire zone was badly charred. There was a real debate about whether the structure was still sound enough to use. They decided it was. The Brooklyn caisson reached its target depth in March 1871, was filled with concrete, and became the permanent base of the Brooklyn Tower. The Manhattan caisson went down in 1871 and immediately presented a different kind of problem. The deeper a caisson goes, the more air pressure is needed to hold back the water. Past a certain pressure, ascending too quickly through the airlock causes nitrogen to come out of the bloodstream in bubbles. Workers called it the bends. Some lost feeling in their limbs after a shift and got it back the next day. Some didn't get it back at all. Some died. The condition had no medical name yet. That came later. In 1871, it was simply what happened to men who came up too fast. And nobody knew how to prevent it except to ascend slowly, which was hard to enforce when a shift ended and men were tired and the airlock was crowded. At least 3 workers died from caisson disease during the Manhattan excavation. Dozens more were seriously injured. Washington Roebling descended into the caissons repeatedly to supervise. In 1872, he came up from a session underground and collapsed. Caisson disease. He was partially paralyzed, in persistent pain, and hypersensitive to light and sound in ways that would never fully go away. He was 34 years old, and he would not set foot on the bridge site again for 11 years. From a bedroom in his house on Columbia Heights in Brooklyn, Washington Roebling could see the construction site. For the next decade, that was the view from which he ran the project. The practical management of the bridge passed to Emily Warren Roebling, his wife. She had no engineering degree, women weren't admitted to engineering programs in the 1870s, but she was educated, mathematically capable, and completely familiar with her husband's methods and calculations. Every morning, Washington briefed her on what needed to happen that day. She went to the site, relayed his instructions to the foreman, inspected the work, reported back, and handled correspondence with the bridge company's board of directors. When board members questioned the chief engineer's continued ability to run the project from his sick room, she was the one who answered them. The project moved because she kept it moving. The Brooklyn Tower was completed in 1875. The Manhattan Tower followed in 1876. Each one required approximately 46,000 tons of granite and limestone quarried in Maine and brought to the site by barge. The foundation courses alone, the lowest stones, were some of the largest cut stones used in any American construction project of the century. Workers raised them using steam-powered derricks and set them to tolerances that the bridge's engineering required. At 272 feet, the towers were the tallest structures in New York. People came from across the city to watch them go up. When the Brooklyn Tower reached its full height, it was visible from miles out in the harbor. Wire spinning began in 1877. This is how a suspension bridge actually gets its strength. The method John Roebling had developed involved running a single wire continuously back and forth between the anchorages on each shore, passing over the tower tops, one pass at a time. Each wire was tensioned to precise specification. The full set was then bound together and wrapped with additional wire to form the finished cable. The 4 main cables would each contain 5,282 individual wires. That is 19,000 miles of steel wire total for the complete bridge. It was slow, precise work, and midway through it ran into its worst crisis. A contractor named J. Lloyd Hay was supplying the bridge wire under contract. In 1878, inspectors discovered that Hay had been substituting rejected wire that had failed tensile strength tests, for approved wire in his shipments to the site. Some of the bad wire was already incorporated into the cables before anyone caught it. The bridge company's board wanted to know whether the entire cable work had to be torn out and redone. Washington Roebling, writing through Emily from Columbia Heights, said no. His calculations showed that even accounting for the weaker wire, the cables were still multiple times stronger than the maximum load they would ever carry, because he had over-engineered them from the start to survive exactly this kind of problem. The board accepted his analysis. Construction continued. Hay went to prison. The cables held. With the cables complete, the deck could begin. Steel wire rope suspenders, vertical hangers were attached to the main cables and used to carry the deck structure below. The deck itself was built outward from both towers simultaneously, adding weight evenly on each side so the cables stayed balanced. Steel trusses stiffened the deck against wind. The roadway went over the trusses, wide enough for 2 elevated rail lines in the center and 2 vehicle lanes on each side, plus pedestrian walkways on the outer edges. The bridge company brought in a team of independent engineers to conduct a formal safety inspection in May 1883. Their conclusion was straightforward. The bridge was not merely adequate, it was the most carefully engineered structure of its kind in the world. Washington Roebling's original insistence on safety margins that most engineers considered excessive had produced a bridge that was far stronger than it needed to be, which was precisely the point. The opening ceremony was May 24, 1883. President Chester A. Arthur attended. Governor Grover Cleveland attended. Fireworks went up from both towers. The crowds on the Brooklyn approach alone were estimated at 10,000 people. Washington Roebling watched from his window on Columbia Heights. Emily Roebling was the first person to officially cross the completed bridge. She carried a rooster, a traditional symbol of victory, as she walked across. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. The bridge had taken 14 years to build and cost $15.1 million, more than double the original estimate. Approximately 27 workers died during construction, most of them from caisson disease or falls. Washington Roebling, who had overseen every stage of the work from his sick room, never fully recovered from the bends. He outlived the bridge's opening by decades, dying in 1926 at 89. But the damage from 1872 stayed with him for the rest of his life. The bridge didn't just connect 2 riverbanks. It changed the shape of New York City in ways that are still visible today. Brooklyn in 1883 was the 3rd largest city in the United States, with its own mayor, government, and identity. Once a permanent crossing existed, the economic case for maintaining 2 separate governments covering essentially the same urban area got harder to make. 15 years later, in 1898, Brooklyn was consolidated into New York City. For Manhattan, the bridge solved a density problem that had no other solution. Manhattan had no eastward release. The bridge made Brooklyn a commuter neighborhood overnight, and the pattern it established, dense outer borough neighborhoods feeding Manhattan employment, defined the shape of New York for the next century. The engineering reach went further still. The caisson technique and Roebling's wire spinning process became the foundation of every major American suspension bridge that followed. When engineers designed the George Washington Bridge and eventually the Golden Gate, they were building on knowledge the Brooklyn Bridge had created. It was not just a crossing, it was the template. 14 years, roughly 30 lives, 1 engineer who never recovered, and a bridge that is still carrying traffic 140 years later. If this caught your attention, hit subscribe and give this video a like.
And let me know in the comments what construction story, place, or eras do you want me to cover next. See you in the next video.